manifest that tendency at the exact same point in temperature. That's why we can mark our thermometers with those specific points, because we know that every single time water becomes solid or becomes liquid at those exact things. It has a tendency to do that. But in addition to tendencies, possible states include capacities. And capacities are much tougher to define. So let me give you an example. You can have, for instance, a knife. Let's take a very simple object to illustrate it. A knife that is sharp. Now, being sharp is a property of a knife. It's always actual. A knife is either sharp or it's not sharp. But whatever it is sharp right now, and it's sharp as an actual matter of fact. On the other hand, in addition to that property, the knife also has capacities. The capacity to cut, for instance. The capacity to cut vegetables, the capacity to cut meat, the capacity to cut flesh. But if that knife, I buy that knife and I put it in the kitchen drawer, and I never take it out of the drawer because I have my older knife that I've been using all along, and that knife never gets to cut anything, that capacity to cut remains always potential. It could have cut something, but it never really did cut anything. It remained always in that drawer, and it now rusted, and it lost its capacity to cut, but it could have cut something. Now, when that capacity to cut does become actual, when it is cutting something, it is always not as a state, like being sharp, but as an event, to cut. And it's an event that is always realized in relationship with something else that had the capacity to be cut. So the event to cut, for instance, when you're cutting a vegetable, you're cutting with a knife, but the vegetable is being cut. So the event is always double, to cut and to be cut. This, by the way, are also events, to freeze, to boil, and are events that occur at that particular point. So events, as opposed to states, states are just static and sit there and endure through time. Events are more instantaneous. Events are more fleeting, and they are more temporal, less spatial as states. Capacities, unlike tendencies, as I said, involve two interacting things: a knife and a vegetable, a knife and a piece of meat, a knife and an arm that is cut. But it always becomes actual, the capacity, as an event, to cut and to be cut. In other words, capacities to affect always need to be coupled to capacities to be affected. But for the same reason that tendencies like steam or ice may be virtual, may be potential at any one time, the same thing with capacities. The capacity to cut of a knife is real, but it may not be actual, which leads Deleuze to say, well, something that is actual is real, but also something that is only virtual. That's the word he uses for potential. Not as in virtual reality, as in digital simulations, but as in a real virtuality. As if this world, this actual world, was constantly in association with a virtual world, which is all the possibilities of all the tendencies that are not being actualized right now, and all the capacities that are not being actualized right now. Now, the world of capacity is much more open than the world of tendencies. A knife has the capacity to cut, but it also has the capacity to kill. Not to kill a vegetable and not to kill a piece of meat, but to kill a living animal with differentiated organs if you pierce one of those vital organs and make it bleed to death. It has many capacities that now depend on the other objects that it can interact with. Now I'm going to return to the question of tendencies and capacities on Wednesday, and I'm going to explain them in a little bit more detail. But as you can tell, for Deleuze, tendencies and capacities are every bit as real as properties. Every bit as mind independent as properties. Both are real, except that these are actual and these are not actual all the time. They're only actual when a tendency is being manifested, when water is actually becoming liquid as an event, becoming ice as the event to freeze, and the capacity to cut is only actual when it is actually cutting in the event to cut. So for Deleuze, both worlds, the actual world and the virtual world, are equally real, although not equally actual. So he makes a difference, a very important philosophical difference between reality and actuality. Because all those possibilities, all those tendencies, and all those capacities are very, very real. Now we're gonna talk about that on Wednesday, and you will see how that extends tremendously the richness of his philosophy. But I'm bringing it up right now because topological thinking, unlike the first two styles that we thought about, that we talked about in the first part of the class, don't need any special mathematics to be thought about. Whereas events that are not real, events that are not actual, that are purely potential, you need something to anchor your thought. You need something to give that kind of a gaseous or very kind of vague idea of something that's just possible. You need something to give it a little bit more substance. And that something is topological thinking. On Wednesday, I'm going to introduce how these spaces that don't need a Cartesian coordinates to be talked about or to be thought about, can serve to, in other words, these spaces can become spaces of possibilities. Every point in the space becomes one possibility, and then the structure of a space of possibilities can be studied by studying the structure of those spaces. I didn't introduce that today, so I haven't talked about how they are structured. They are structured by something called singularities. We're going to talk about that on Wednesday. It's a very important concept in Deleuze, but it's a concept that comes from mathematics. So, even this that seems a little kind of didn't really quite fit in today's class has a purpose and has a very specific role to play in a Deleuzian world. A world that is inhabited by actual entities that are mind independent, as well as by virtual entities that are mind independent. All the unrealized tendencies and all the unexercised capacities that things have. That is, in a way, one of the very original aspects to this philosophy, to include real but non-actual entities. Right now we want to switch to an entirely different the world of subjectivity. Because as much as we want to affirm as materialists that there's a world that exists independently of our minds, we have to admit that one of the inhabitants of that world, one of the entities that populates that world, is minds. And it's minds that evolved in that world, in interaction with that world. The question now is how to conceive of those minds. On one hand, we can conceive them as there being a continuity with animal minds. This is something that few philosophers think about. Most philosophers think of the mind as a specifically human thing. Deleuze, on the other hand, is constantly talking about animals, because animals have minds. Now, pet owners know this very well. I don't happen to have pets because I live in New York, or in tiny little apartments you need to have Chihuahua dogs, and there's no way I could possibly do that. But any owner of a dog, any owner of a cat, any owner of a horse knows that